This is a reading of the book, The Witchery of Archery by Maurice Thompson. And the second edition, which this is, was published in 1879. The Witchery of Archery, Chapter 1. Prefatory Remarks. I have not proposed writing a history of archery. The object has been to present in the simplest way some of my own adventures by field and flood, from which the reader might easily gather a comprehensive knowledge of the theory and practice of a sport which is as harmless and fascinating as it is old and honorable. It may not be amiss, however, to here sketch an outline of the rise of archery in England, the great mother of archers. It is a well-worn saying that experience is a perfect school. In his school at the hands of William the Norman on the field of Hastings, the English took their first great lesson in archery, which resulted in embellishing in their hearts a profound admiration, almost amounting to veneration, for the longbows and resistless arrows of their conquerors. With a wise foresight, the victorious invader gave into the hands of his subjugated enemies these simple but powerful weapons, and by a shrewd stroke of policy, made the very carrying of a bow and shafts a badge of a freeman. He well knew that upon missile weapons of the superior range and penetration he must depend for all future success in war, and that nothing could cement a people like the sword of democracy and the military idea. Therefore he adroitly managed to make the longbow and arrows the weapons alike of the rich and poor, noble and peasant, the miserable serf being the only person denied their use. From this time forward the longbow rapidly grew in public favor, until by years of loving practice the English yeoman made it the terror of the world in battle. It became the one instrument of force in field sports common to patrician and plebeian, king and esquire. It may well be said that the powerful government of Great Britain rests upon a foundation of iron arrowheads, and that its greatest glory has been achieved by the hard shooting of its archers, that its history's most brilliant pages have been graven on imperishable tablets with the bodkin-pointed shafts of the yeomen who drew bows at Crecy and Agincourt, and all these fights where its supremacy over Europe was enforced by the whistling gray goose wing. Nothing but the most costly and elaborate Spanish coats of mail could withstand a cloth-yard arrow from a 90-pound English longbow. The French rulers tried in vain for many years to educate their subjects in archery so as to return their Norman Saxon enemies missile for missile. The clumsy crossbow, however, was their only efficient projectile weapon, and its inferiority to the 6-foot yew was made patent on many a bloody field. In a word, the history of England from the Norman conquest down to the day where firearms supplanted the longbow and arrows as military and hunting weapons is the history of archery, and may be read otherwhere. But the 6-foot yew could not wholly flee before the rifle and fowling piece. It was not so easily cast out from the hands of people whose fathers had made it famous forevermore. The old toxophyte societies kept up their organizations, and from time to time new ones were formed, until archery, about the last of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, took shape as par excellence the sport of nobility and gentry of England, Scotland, and Wales. In 1840, Mr. George Agar Hansard published at London a large volume entitled The Book of Archery, in which was brought together everything of interest connected with its subject, which years of careful labor had enabled him to discover. This gave a new impulse to the royal sport, which obtains to this day. In the United States, there existed no archery organizations prior to the publication, and in some of our own literary magazines, of a number of my own papers descriptive of longbow shooting on the lawn and by field and flood. At present, there are hundreds of clubs from Maine to Texas. The spread of the toxophyte mania, as someone had named it, has been so sudden and wide that our dealers have been unable to supply the demand for archery tackle. And in most of our towns and villages, the manufacture of rather clumsy, but by no means worthless longbows and arrows has been quite a paying business. In the following pages, I have attempted to afford the newly initiated archer such entertainment as the stories of a veteran, however poorly told, are surely to possess for the tyro. If, on the other hand, this book happened to fall into the hands of an old and experienced archer, Let him not cast it aside unread, for many things in it will be new, even to him. Of archery as a lawn game, everything is told in the appendix. I have there drawn together the fullest information possible on all that pertains to practical bow shooting, and the use and manufacture of all the implements of the archer craft. All is taken from my own experience. Not a rule is laid down which I have not practically tested. During the 15 years that as an archer I have roamed the woods, I have tried every kind of bow I could procure, from the plain mulberry stick made with my own hands, to a bow of snakewood wrought in the Far East by Indian cunning, and every sort of arrow from a rudely feathered reed to the finest Highland ever made. I have shot in all kinds of weather, by day and by night, and do not feel that egotism ought to be counted against me when I offer to describe some of my adventures, even if the offending pronoun does not dance pretty freely among my pages. Furthermore, I have keenly enjoyed writing these chapters as a lazy way of living over and again some charming days of excitement and novel sport, and as a tentative venture into the field of bookmaking as inviting as it is narrow and difficult of access. The manual of archery given in the appendix contains everything my experience has suggested, as well as a practical part of Mr. Hansard's work. I have spared no pains in reducing the simplest and directest rules and maxims, all that is necessary, to a perfect practice of bow shooting for either hunting or target purposes. It was thought advisable in the good old days of prefaces to forestall or disarm criticism by some special plea or another, but although I have indulged in something akin to the ancient preface, I shall not deny the critic what comfort he may find in making literary faces at my book. Let him say whatever his sense of duty compels. I know, and you know, reader, that these tales of a careless archer have made him, for the time, an honest fellow, and as reading them he listened to the twang of the bow cord and the keen hiss of the arrow by the reedy lakes or in the dark, lone woods of the South and West. If he give me due credit for this brief effort, he may leave the rest to the archers and all the sport-loving folk for whom this book is written. Of one thing I am sure, no amount of criticism, just or unjust, can turn from me my stomach, sympathetic and enthusiastic friends, the boys and girls of America. I know too well how the rosy-cheeked misses will enjoy the lawn practice with their associates, and the boys how they will dream all sorts of adventures in the wild green woods of summer. The chapters following are arrayed with a view to contrast, as they have nothing in them by which they can be linked together, so as to form even the semblance of a continuous narrative. They are the pleasantest and cheeriest fragments of my wildwood days with bow and quiver, put together without any attempt at high art, for those who love the outdoors and the merry life of the hunter and naturalist. While it has often been necessary, in order to avoid too much skipping about, to dovetail into certain parts of my sketches incidents, the adventures, and not properly belonging to the time and locality, I advere to know where I have departed from truth in the descriptions of places and things. That I have in a few instances drawn upon my fancy for some local coloring, when the outlines of the landscapes could not be recollected, I cannot admit or deny. And if I have occasionally dropped into poetry, I assure the reader that it does not come higher. After all, this book is for the archer, and everything in it pertaining to the sport may be relied upon as having come of the very best practice of the noble exercise of archery. Chapter 2. Outline sketch of the practice of archery and hunting. Cheerily blow the bugle horn in the cool green woods of morn. Loose the hounds and let them go. Wax the cord and bend the bow. So long as the new moon returns in heaven, a bent, beautiful bow, so long as it will the fascination of archery keep hold of the hearts of men, you have had but to mention an archer or archery to your friend, and immediately his interest is aroused. He may scoff at the bow and sneer at the arrow, but he will inquire and show curiosity. Hang a longbow and quiver of arrows conspicuously in your hall or library, and you will soon discover that no exquisite painting or bit of statuary will receive from guests more attention than will be accorded to these ancient weapons. No doubt if one could procure a shell strung with gold and silver cords, after the fashion of an old-time instrument with which the gods made music, the fascination would attach. Indeed, the lyre was suggested by the bow, Music and poetry sprang from our weapon. The bow is the old first lyre, the monochord, the initial rune of fine art. It is inseparably connected to the history of the culture, as are the alphabets of the learned languages. The humanities grew out of the archery as a flower from a seed. No sooner did the soft, sweet note of the bowstring charm the ear of the genius than the music was born, and from music came poetry, painting, and sculpture. What the fragments of Sapphire Song and the Homerific epics are to the literature of today, the bow is to the weapons of today. The Sapphic songs were the natural music of love. The Homeric epics were the natural outpourings of great self-sufficient souls surcharged with the inspiration of heroism. So the bow was a natural weapon of the simple, perfect physical manhood represented in the idea of Apollo, who with the drawn bow was a symbol of such manhood displayed in its highest powers and graces. When a man shoots a bow, it is his own vigor of body that drives the arrow, and his own mind controls the missile's flight. When the archer hears a shaft hiss through the air with a force not to be equaled by those of his competitors, he feels justly proud of his superior manhood. His trained, muscled, and toughened thews have done the work. Not so with gun shooting. The rifle or fowling piece is charged with a powder acting independently of muscular operations and will shoot just as powerfully for the schoolboy or the weakling as it will for the athlete. It is the hand of the babe which discharged the dynamite at Hellgate, so the pressure of an invalid's finger will send a rifle ball as far and as true as if the gun had been fired by Hercules, steadiest of aim alone being required. The bow and arrows are as old as man. If the origin of any implants of human invention can be accepted as of prehistoric date, even in hieroglyphic history, the archer's curved stick and feathered missiles are entitled to the honor of being placed first on the list. Of the venerable monuments of ingenuity discovered by our remotest ancestors and preserved in their records, not one is surely as traceable through the shadows of doubtful history to an existence beyond the limits of tradition. The gods were mostly archers, and the goddesses too, making the bow a classical figure, indispensable with the poets of both ancient and modern times, sharp as an arrow, swift as an arrow, straight as an arrow. The shafts of envy, love, hatred, and revenge, etc., are expressions as common to the verse makers of our own time as those of Pindar and Homer, and using them subjects no one to charge of bad taste, while straight as a ramrod or swift as birdshot, the buckshot of envy or the cartridges of malice would be thought expressions or phrases of very questionable propriety in a grave essay or in a brilliant poem. In fact, as I have said, the bow is one of the primitive humanities, one of the original elements of the culture. It is a classic. On the other hand, however, it is curious to note how surely the bow and arrows have found their way into the hands of all wild peoples whose mode of life has been made physical culture a necessity with them, and it is equally interesting and significant to discover that among these wild peoples, a chieftain is invariably chosen on account of his ability to draw a mighty bow. We are nothing better than refined and enlightened savages. The fiber of our nature is not charged in substance, it is polished and oiled. The wild side of the prism of humanity still offers its pleasures to us, and it is helpful and essentially necessary to broad culture that we accept them in moderation. Sport, by which is meant pleasant physical and mental exercise combined, play in the best sense. A requirement of this being wild element, this glossed over heathen side of our being, and the bow is its natural implement. One day, not long ago, my brother, the Will often mentioned hereafter, and I were practicing at a target on a green lawn, when a miserably clad and hunger-pinched tramp approached us. Rags and dirt could not hide, nor could hunger and humiliation blunt the edge of a certain manliness of bearing, as he touched his torn hat and paused near us. Could we give him a bite to eat or a few pence to buy him a cheap dinner? He was very hungry, the old story. We sent a lad who was scoring for us to the house to inquire if any cooked victuals were in the pantry, and then resumed our shooting. The tramp stood by watching us. Finally, it was impelled by irresistible interest. He said, "Archery is a noble sport." We turned and looked at him. He waved his hand in a particularly graceful way, and in a sad voice said, "On Brighton sands I have seen good shooting. I have shot there myself." In England? Asked Will. Yes, he replied. I'm a gentleman. Will replied doubtfully. Would you let me shoot once? He said. There was sincerity in his voice. Will handed him his bow and arrow. He took them eagerly, almost snatching them. For a moment he stood as if irresolute, and then, quickly fixing the arrow to the string, drew and let fly. The movements were those of a trained archer. The distance was 40 yards, and he hit the gold in its very center. Will and I looked at each other and at the tramp. We were overpowered. Will posted off to my horse at once and returned with a bottle of wine and a tray of biscuits and tongue, with which that archer tramp did most ravenously regale himself. I mention this to clinch my theory, viz., that neither poverty, nor shame, nor hunger, nor disposition, nor anything but death can ever quite destroy the merry, innocent, Arcadian, heathen part of our nature, that takes to a bow and arrows as naturally as a butterfly takes to a flower. Taking wild game has nearly ceased to be reckoned among the means of gaining a livelihood, and has fallen and risen, as one may view it, to the level of a sport, or the means of recreation, from the exhaustion to the depression consequent to the civilized methods of self-destruction called business. Formerly, table comforts of the most necessary sort had to be procured by the skill or luck of the huntsman, as the game yearly grew more wary and difficult to approach, as well as more scarce, while the demand for it steadily increased. Necessity invented firearms, that terrible source of slaughter which has at last reduced shooting to less than a sport. The limits of this chapter will not even admit of even being the most condensed statement of the combination of causes which has been so revolutionized hunting with the gun. That, as it has the fashion to follow it now, cannot be recommended as either helpful or pleasant. It is not sport to sling a handful of, say, from 300 to 700 pellets at a bird. The true sportsman finds his chief delight not in the number of birds or other game brought to bag, but in the brilliancy of his shooting. As regards, no man ought to brag of knocking down 2 quails left and right under ordinary circumstances of field shooting. Let us have a look at the thing for a moment. Say if you have 400 pellets in each barrel of your gun, either of which barrels will, at 40 yards, spread the number pretty evenly over 9 square feet of space. Say at 25 yards, the ordinary limit of quail shooting range, your gun will cover 2 square feet thickly with shot. See what a margin for successful inaccuracy. In one case, you may aim 18 inches, and the other a foot off your bird, and yet kill it. With a good choke bore shotgun, you may hit a duck 100 yards in the same way. A moment's reflection cannot fail to suggest to sportsmen the calamity of these absolutely murderous weapons are hastening forward. The shotgun will soon exterminate game. It has already exterminated it in many large areas. The very sound of a gun is terrible to all the wild things. A few more years and hunting will be a thing of the past unless some change takes place in our methods of destroying game. I would not be understood as decrying the shotgun when it kept in its place and used only for the sort of game that cannot, from the nature of its habits, be shot except when flying, as the woodcock and the marsh hen, the snipe, and most waterfowl, quails, and grouse. It is the abuse of gun shooting, the terrible slaughter committed by pot hunters, that I deplore. I was yet in my teens when I was taught the use of the longbow by Thomas Williams, an old hermit of a fellow, whose cabin stood in the middle of a vast pine forest that bordered my father's plantation in the beautiful hill country of North Georgia. My brother Will and I had been practicing archery in a boyish way for some years before Williams gave us lessons, but although we had had our own efforts become expert in the making and the use of our weapons, we found to our chagrin that before we could dare call ourselves bowmen, all we had learned must be thrown away as an art mastered whose difficulty seemed insurmountable. Williams was an incomparable archer and delighted in practicing with his favorite weapons, but a strange timidity so mastered him that no amount of pleading on our part would prevail him to make any public exposition of his skill. We could never get him to come forth boldly and join us in the delightful excursions we undertook to various shooting grounds after his careful training had made more accurate and enthusiastic bowmen of us. The woodpecker, thrushes, grosbeak in the woods immediately surrounding his cabin were the only live marks he ever sought, excepting that occasionally he shot hares by moonlight in an open glade situated a half-mile deeper in the forest. Of course, before you try to shoot game, you must practice shooting at some kind of mark. For this purpose, a target was not recommended, since one who is trained to aim at a large, graduated disc like that of a lawn target, either with a gun or bow, can rarely shoot well at birds or other small game. The reason is that target shooting at a fixed distance, one gets used to a certain size, color, condition of backgrounds. And when he gets in the woods, he lifts his bow to draw on a bird or hare. His accustomed rings and gay background are not there. His vision is blurred consequently, and he draws waveringly and shoots indifferently. A black rubber ball 4 inches in diameter, suspended midair by the string, fastened to a low bough of an apple tree, makes a first-rate substitute for a bird. A small bag of straw placed on the ground and shot out about 20 yards gives a good hare practice. You will soon discover that the great advantage gained by not using the same distance all the time. For after all, a bowman's skill is scarcely worthy of admiration if it is confined to one range. It is when you have learned to shoot well at all distances between 10 and 50 yards, and betake yourself to the woods and fields, that archery becomes a truly royal sport. And not till then do you begin fairly to draw upon the various sources compassed by the art. Your first shooting at wild things should be carefully done, choosing the tamest and least wary of birds in order that your shots may be at very short range and the results accurately noted. See if you shoot too high or too low, too far to the left or the right, and try to cure the fault. You must not think of the game till you have killed a number of woodpeckers, meadowlarks, and field sparrows. 3 things are requisite to bird shooting with the bow. First, you must know how, under all circumstances and over all kinds of ground surface, to quickly and accurately measure distance with the eye. Second, you must be quick and noiseless as a cat in your movements. Thirdly, you must draw uniform, that is, put the same power on every shot, no matter how near or far the bird may be. In other words, draw to the head of your arrow every time you draw. When after considerable experience and success at the mark practice, you begin to shoot in the woods, you will discover that this is to be a good shot is not to half of what it takes to make you a tolerable bird slayer. Some of the finest shots you will ever make will be misses, and some of the poorest will be center hits, such as luck. But in starting out, you need not fear the woodpecker shooting will be poor sport. Some of my happiest bouts in the woods have owed all their charm to the excitement of chasing an ivory bill, a redhead, or a sapsucker from tree to tree, whacking away at him whenever he got still, watching the flight of my arrow as it whisked past him, or struck close to him with a ringing rap like the blow of a hammer, till at last I plumped him over, stringing him halfway down the shaft. In a succeeding chapter we will shoot woodpeckers together. To do regular even shooting requires a great deal of preparatory practice at unequal distances under large variety of influences, with every difference of surrounding and in all sorts of weather. In fact, you will never be a good shot till all the operations of archery are performed as naturally and almost as involuntary as your breathing. For instance, a meadowlark shows his yellow breast in a bunch of clover blossoms or in a tuft of timothy stubble, 30 yards distance from you. You halt instantly, throw up your bow quickly and gracefully, draw an arrow to the head and let it go sharply, all with as little effort and precisely with the same half-involuntary, half-mechanical accuracy with which you take so many steps in walking. Your arrow flies with a keen hiss straight to the mark and knocks a bird over and over amid a cloud of gold feathers and clover or grass leaves. When you can do this one time out of 10 or even 20 paces, you may begin to call yourself an archer. But do not grow discouraged if it takes a long while to get such ordinary proficiency. There is no excellence in archery without great labor. The pewter-headed arrows described in the appendix of this book should be used for all kinds of small birds. For shooting hare and wild fowl, the large game, the broad-headed and barbed shafts are necessary. When you have reached a reasonable proficiency in the use of your weapons at a fixed mark, the next thing to think of shooting on is shooting on the wing, as killing birds while they are flying is called. For this sort of practice, make a springboard controlled by a trigger, so that when a string is pulled, a ball of rubber, for that matter any soft material, is thrown from it into the air, after the manner of glass balls from a Bogardes trap. You will begin shooting, at a very large ball first, and decrease its size to about 3 inches in diameter as you progress. You'll be surprised to find how soon you will learn to hit a 6-inch ball at 10 or 15 paces when thrown with considerable force into the air. This accomplished, you may begin shooting at tame pigeons let go from a trap, or at meadowlarks as they rise from the clover. Daily practice and great care will soon work wonders. 2 years of sincere, systematic attention to the tried rules of archery will render you an expert, ready to knock down a flying grouse or wood duck, able to pierce a deer through the shoulders at 100 yards. You will then be found in the jungles of Florida following the hounds after a deer, a bear, a panther, and handling a 90-pound snakewood bow and 3-ounce broadhead hunting shafts with all the ease and power of a Tartar chieftain. Or mayhap your tent will be beside some far northern brook, where the speckled trout leap out after the flies, and where the dappled fawns come out of the bush to wade in the cold water. But first, before you can blow the bugle horn or follow the hounds, you must be content to chase the woodpecker. It's the end of the 2nd chapter of the Witchery of Archery. I'll add more next week, I believe. What he talks about in the book, the bird hunting, that has been long since illegal and not condoned. It's a book from the 1800s of where they lived different times, different lives in different places under different rules, and game was much more plentiful, and he was right. There was many things wiped out, passenger pigeons among them. But yet, archery is a sport that is hard won, and I rather like it.
Smash the subscribe button, such as you would your fearsome foe.